What if the war everyone thinks is still just missiles and drones is actually turning into something much bigger? What if the next stage of this conflict is not in the sky, but on the ground? If that thought just gave you a small chill, good, because you need to feel that before we go any further. Before we get into the details, do one simple thing. Tap that like button right now because it costs you nothing, but it tells this channel to keep digging for the truth. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next update, and send this video to one person who still thinks this war is far away from becoming something much bigger. Here is where things stand right now, as clearly as we can lay it out. For months, the United States and Iran have been locked in a conflict that started earlier this year, in late February 2026, when strikes first began under what officials have referred to as a large military operation. A temporary truce was reached in the middle of June, a signed agreement meant to pause the fighting. But that pause did not last. According to multiple reports, the ceasefire broke down, and by mid-July, the two sides were back to trading strikes almost every night. Officials with United States Central Command have reported hitting a long list of targets inside Iran. These reportedly include drone storage sites, air defense systems, coastal radar stations, naval equipment, and command centers connected to Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Iranian state media has also reported strikes on cities including Tehran, Tabriz, Bandar Abbas, and Chabahar. Some of these reports describe damage to bridges, power stations, and other infrastructure, and Iranian officials claim that civilians have been hurt in these strikes as well. None of these individual casualty figures can be fully verified from outside sources, so we are presenting them the way they have been reported, not as confirmed fact. Now here is the part that has caught everyone's attention. According to a senior Iranian official speaking to international media, Tehran claims it has been preparing for a ground war for decades, and says its forces are ready to meet American troops if they ever set foot on Iranian soil. That is a bold statement, and whether it reflects genuine confidence or just tough talk for the cameras is something we cannot know for certain. But the fact that Iranian officials are speaking this way, out loud, on camera, tells us that the idea of a ground operation is no longer a fringe theory. It is being discussed at the highest levels on both sides. On the American side, reports from major outlets, including the Washington Post, suggest that the Pentagon has been asked to prepare plans for expanded operations, possibly stretching over several weeks. It is important to say, clearly, plans being prepared is not the same as plans being approved. Militaries draw up options all the time that never get used. But the fact that these options reportedly include the possibility of ground forces, not just continued airstrikes, is a meaningful shift in tone. President Trump has publicly floated the idea of a ground campaign without fully committing to it. He has also said, according to reports, that other partner nations might be the ones to carry out any ground engagement rather than American forces alone. That detail matters a lot, because a ground invasion led by the United States looks completely different from a ground invasion supported by the United States, but carried out by regional partners or allied forces. One means tens of thousands of American troops moving across the border. The other means a much smaller footprint, with American power used mostly for air support, intelligence, and precision strikes. So which one are we actually looking at? Let's break down what we know and separate the facts from the speculation. First, the scale of Iran itself. Iran is a country of around 86 million people. Estimates from defense analysts suggest Iran's military includes several 100,000 active duty troops, backed by hundreds of thousands more in reserve forces, along with the Revolutionary Guard's own separate command structure. A full-scale invasion aimed at occupying the country would require a troop commitment on a scale not seen in decades, along with supply lines stretching across difficult terrain, and enough time to prepare that it could not be kept secret. Most military analysts who have spoken publicly on this topic say a full occupation of Iran is extremely unlikely, simply because of the cost, the risk, and the lack of political appetite for something that large. Second, what is actually being discussed is something narrower. Reports suggest options on the table may include limited operations, such as securing specific islands or coastal points in the Strait of Hormuz, special forces raids on specific facilities, or supporting local and allied ground elements rather than deploying massive conventional forces. One location that keeps coming up in reporting is Kharg Island, an important oil export terminal for Iran. Analysts note that gaining control or disrupting operations there could apply serious economic pressure on the Iranian government without requiring troops to march across the entire country. This is where the real strategy becomes visible. Several analysts with military and intelligence backgrounds have suggested that economic pressure may be a more effective tool than ground combat alone. If a government's income is choked off, especially income tied to oil exports, that pressure can build in a way that raw military force sometimes cannot. But there is a serious catch. Squeezing an economy that hard risks creating a humanitarian crisis for ordinary Iranian citizens who have far less control over their government's decisions than outsiders sometimes assume. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire strategy. The tools available to apply pressure on a government often land hardest on the people who have the least power to change that government's course. There is also the question of internal unrest. Iran has seen waves of protests in recent years, often tied to economic hardship. Some analysts believe continued economic pressure could reignite similar unrest. But history here offers a hard lesson. Previous protest movements inside Iran have been met with severe crackdowns by security forces, and ordinary protesters, often unarmed, have faced significant risk simply for showing up. That history shapes how cautious any outside observer should be about assuming a population will simply rise up the moment pressure increases. People know exactly what they are risking, and that knowledge shapes their choices. Now let's talk about what a limited ground operation might actually look like if it happens, based on how modern combined military operations are generally structured. In situations like this, ground forces typically do not move without extensive air support. Close air support aircraft are designed specifically to work with troops on the ground, providing cover, identifying threats, and striking targets in coordination with forward air controllers, who are personnel embedded with ground units to help direct that air support accurately. This kind of coordination is what allows smaller ground elements to operate more safely, because the aircraft above them can respond quickly if trouble appears. Alongside piloted aircraft, modern militaries increasingly rely on drone technology, both for surveillance and for strike capability. Reports indicate that newer drone systems can operate alongside manned aircraft, extending their reach and providing additional protection. This kind of layered approach, combining traditional aircraft with newer drone technology, reflects how military operations have evolved significantly even over the past few years. If any ground element does end up operating inside or near Iranian territory, analysts widely expect Iran's response to lean heavily on asymmetric tactics rather than open battlefield engagements. That means improvised explosive devices, ambush-style attacks, and the kind of guerrilla tactics that Iranian-backed groups have reportedly used in past conflicts across the region. This is precisely why military planners tend to avoid large, slow-moving troop concentrations in this kind of environment. The lessons learned from past conflicts in the region, where insurgent tactics caused significant casualties over extended periods, are almost certainly shaping how any new operation would be planned, if it happens at all. Estimates from defense research groups suggest Iran maintains hundreds of thousands of active duty troops, with hundreds of thousands more available as reserves, alongside the separate command structure of the Revolutionary Guard and various allied militia forces spread across the region. That combination of manpower and decentralized organization is exactly why so many analysts describe Iran as degraded by months of strikes, but not disarmed and not defeated. A weakened air defense system and damaged command centers are serious setbacks, but they do not erase an entire military's ability to fight defensively on its own soil, especially using tactics designed around ambush, concealment, and attrition, rather than open confrontation. There is a reason that kind of defensive fighting style is so difficult to counter. It does not require matching the technology of a more advanced military. It requires patience, local knowledge, and a willingness to absorb losses over a long period while making every advance costly for the other side. Military historians have pointed to exactly this pattern in multiple past conflicts, where a technologically superior force struggled not because it lost major battles, but because the steady drip of smaller losses over months and years eventually wore down political will back home. That history is almost certainly part of every serious planning conversation happening right now behind closed doors. Let's also step back and look at how we got here, because the roots of this conflict go back further than the headlines from this week suggest. Reports indicate the current round of fighting traces back to an operation that began in late February 2026, a campaign that has continued, paused, and restarted multiple times since then. Ceasefires have been announced before, including the mid-June agreement mentioned earlier, and each time, hopes rose that the fighting might actually be over. Each time within weeks, something broke that fragile peace. This pattern matters, because it tells us something about the difficulty of ending this kind of conflict through paperwork alone. A signed agreement can pause fighting for a while, but it cannot resolve the deeper disagreements driving the conflict in the first place. Until those root disagreements are addressed, whether they involve nuclear capability, regional influence, or control over shipping lanes, any pause is likely to remain fragile. It also helps to understand why the Strait of Hormuz keeps coming up in this story. This narrow stretch of water sits between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, and a significant share of the world's oil shipments pass through it every single day. Reports indicate Iran has threatened action against vessels moving through these waters, and the United States has responded with warnings of its own, including reported statements that any attack on shipping would trigger strikes on specific infrastructure inside Iran. This tit-for-tat dynamic, strike answered by strike, threat answered by threat, is part of what makes this conflict so volatile. Every action seems to invite a matching reaction, and neither side appears willing to be the one that backs down first in public. Now let's bring in the question everyone keeps asking. If ground forces do get involved, whose forces are we actually talking about? Reports suggest the answer may not be a simple one. There has been talk of involving Kurdish groups in the region, some of whom have a long and complicated relationship with the United States, shaped by decades of shifting alliances, and at times, feelings of being let down when previous commitments did not fully hold. There has also been discussion of arming or supporting Iranian citizens who oppose the current government, though analysts caution that any organized, large-scale internal resistance movement inside Iran does not currently appear to exist at a scale capable of matching the Revolutionary Guard's own forces and allied militias. That imbalance in raw power is a serious obstacle for anyone hoping that internal uprising alone could reshape the country's leadership without significant outside support. There's also the international dimension to consider. Any large-scale ground operation would almost certainly draw reactions from other countries in the region and beyond, including formal statements from international bodies, concern from allied governments about regional stability, and renewed debate at home in the United States about whether military action of this scale requires formal authorization from Congress. That debate over who has the legal authority to commit a country to an extended ground conflict is not just a technical detail. It shapes how sustainable any operation can be over the following months, especially if public support shifts as costs become clearer. All right, that was a lot of important detail, so let's pause for one moment. If this kind of grounded, careful breakdown is what you come here for, make sure you are subscribed, because we are going to keep tracking this story as it develops, and there is more happening every single day than most headlines manage to capture. Drop a comment below telling me what you think should happen next. I genuinely want to see your take. Now here is something worth sitting with for a moment. There have also been reports of American service members killed in the region amid this period of renewed conflict. These reports are a sober reminder that even limited military operations carry real human cost, on all sides. Behind every strategic discussion about troop movements and strike targets, there are real families waiting for news, and real lives that do not come back once they are lost. It is easy, watching from a distance, to talk about military strategy as if it were a chess match. It is not. Every piece on this board is a person. The same is true on the other side of this conflict. Iran's health ministry has reported civilian casualties tied to the recent strikes, including women and children among the wounded, according to state media reporting. These figures come from a government source involved in the conflict, so they should be treated with appropriate caution rather than accepted as fully independent, but the broader pattern they describe of infrastructure damage and civilian harm accompanying military strikes is consistent with reporting from independent journalists and aid organizations working in the region. War rarely stays confined to purely military targets, no matter how precise modern weapons have become, and every additional night of strikes appears to widen the circle of people affected by this conflict, well beyond soldiers and officials. This is also where the economic dimension becomes so morally complicated. Cutting off a government's oil revenue, disrupting its shipping routes, and applying sustained financial pressure can be an effective way to constrain a regime's ability to fund its military and security forces. But those same pressures inevitably touch ordinary households first, through rising prices, shortages, and strained public services. Analysts who support strong economic pressure argue that this pain, while real and regrettable, may ultimately be less costly in human terms than a prolonged ground war. Others argue that a government willing to crack down harshly on its own protesters is unlikely to change course simply because its population is suffering economically, since history shows some governments are willing to let their people bear enormous hardship rather than give up power. Both of these views are held by serious, informed people, and neither can be dismissed as unreasonable. So where does that leave us? On one side, you have a country, Iran, that has publicly claimed it is prepared for and even welcomes a ground confrontation. A statement that could reflect genuine confidence in years of preparation, or could simply be a message aimed at showing strength to its own population and to the world. On the other side, you have the United States weighing options that reportedly range from continued air campaigns to limited ground operations, to a broader combined approach involving regional partners. Nothing here is settled. Plans being drawn up are not the same as decisions being made, and public statements from officials on both sides often serve political purposes as much as military ones. What we can say with more confidence is this: the idea of a purely aerial conflict, with strikes traded back and forth indefinitely, does not appear to be a stable long-term outcome. Something is likely to shift, whether that is a return to serious diplomatic talks, an expansion into more direct ground involvement, or a continuation of targeted economic and infrastructure pressure designed to force a change without full-scale invasion. Each of these paths carries different risks, different costs, and different outcomes for millions of people who have no say in any of it. Let's also address something important about how this story is being covered. A lot of headlines lean toward the most dramatic possible framing, because dramatic headlines get attention. That does not mean the underlying situation is fake. Far from it. The strikes, the casualties, and the diplomatic breakdown are all real and well documented. But it does mean viewers, including you watching right now, should stay a little skeptical of any single source claiming to know exactly what happens next. Nobody outside a very small circle of decision makers actually knows for certain whether a larger ground operation is coming or when. What we do know is that the infrastructure for a bigger operation, communication systems, logistics planning, coordination between agencies, appears to be moving forward according to multiple independent reports. Whether that infrastructure gets used for a full campaign or remains a pressure tactic aimed at forcing negotiations is something only time will answer. There's also a broader regional dimension worth understanding. This conflict does not exist in isolation. Iran-backed groups operate in multiple countries across the region, and tensions have flared in more than one place at once. Analysts tracking this situation note that a wider ground campaign inside Iran could have ripple effects well beyond its borders, potentially drawing in additional actors or triggering responses from allied and proxy forces elsewhere. This is part of why so many military planners appear cautious about a large-scale ground invasion. The risk of the conflict spreading rather than staying contained is a real concern raised repeatedly by analysts and former officials. At the same time, there are voices within the current administration and among outside advisors who argue that showing a credible willingness to escalate, including the credible threat of ground forces, could actually be what pushes the other side toward a genuine settlement. The logic here is that without a real threat behind the words, a government under pressure has less incentive to change course. Whether that logic holds up in practice is a subject of real debate among people who study these situations professionally, and reasonable, well-informed people disagree about it. It is also worth thinking about how neighboring countries are experiencing this moment. Reports indicate strikes and retaliatory fire have reached beyond Iran's own borders, affecting shipping and infrastructure in nearby nations, including reported impacts on port and power facilities in the wider Gulf region. Countries in that area, some of them close allies of the United States, are watching this situation with understandable concern, since their own security and economies are tied closely to stability in the Strait of Hormuz. A wider ground campaign inside Iran would not stay neatly contained within one country's borders. Regional partners could face pressure to become more directly involved, either supporting operations logistically or facing retaliation themselves from Iran-aligned forces operating outside Iran's own territory. That regional ripple effect is a major reason so many governments outside the two main parties are pushing quietly for a return to negotiations rather than further escalation. There is also a longer historical thread running underneath all of this. Tensions between the United States and Iran are not new. They stretch back decades through periods of open hostility, quiet diplomacy, broken agreements, and renewed confrontation. Anyone hoping for a quick, clean resolution to this specific chapter should probably temper those expectations, because the underlying disputes driving this conflict, questions of regional power, weapons development, and control over vital shipping routes, have proven resistant to quick fixes for a very long time. That does not mean resolution is impossible. It means any lasting resolution will likely require sustained diplomatic effort well beyond whatever happens in the coming weeks of military maneuvering. So where does this leave the average person watching from home, wondering what actually happens next? Honestly, the most accurate answer is that we are in a genuine period of uncertainty. The pieces are moving. Statements are being made publicly that would have been unthinkable in quieter times. Military assets are reportedly being positioned, and yet no formal ground invasion has been announced or confirmed as of the most recent reporting available. That gap between what is being prepared and what is actually being ordered is exactly where the next chapter of this story is going to be written. Pay close attention in the coming days to a few specific signals rather than the loudest headlines. Watch for any formal congressional briefings or votes related to military authorization, since those tend to reflect real decisions rather than speculation. Watch for movement of additional naval or amphibious assets into the region, since logistics are harder to fake than public statements. And watch for any renewed diplomatic contact between the two sides, since a sudden return to the negotiating table often signals that both governments see more to lose than to gain from further escalation. These are the kinds of concrete details that tend to matter far more than any single dramatic quote from an official trying to project strength. It also helps to remember that the people making these decisions are working with information the rest of us simply do not have access to. Satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and detailed intelligence assessments all shape choices that get announced to the public only in broad, simplified terms. That gap between what decision makers know and what the public sees is part of why speculation fills in so quickly, and why so many competing predictions circulate at once, each one sounding confident, each one claiming to know what happens next. The honest answer is that outside observers, including everyone making bold predictions online, are working with a much smaller piece of the full picture than they often let on. One more thing worth remembering here: wars rarely unfold the way early predictions suggest they will. Plans change. Political pressure shifts. Public opinion at home affects decisions in ways that are not always visible from outside. What looks certain today can look completely different within a matter of weeks. That is not a reason to stop paying attention. It is exactly the opposite. It is a reason to keep watching closely, with a clear head, rather than assuming any single headline tells the whole story. Before we wrap up, one more quick thing. If you have made it this far, you clearly care about getting the real picture here, not just the loudest headline. So do this small thing for me. Share this video with someone who has been asking you what is actually going on with Iran, because a lot of people are confused right now, and a clear explanation like this one is worth more than another shouting match on a talk show. Let's bring this together. This is not a simple story of one side winning and one side losing. It is a slow, tense standoff between a government that says it is ready for the worst and another government weighing just how far it is willing to go to force a change. Somewhere in between those two positions sit millions of ordinary people. Iranian civilians living under strikes they did not choose, American families of service members deployed to a region far from home, and regional neighbors caught in the crossfire of a conflict that keeps threatening to grow larger than anyone originally intended. If there is one thing worth taking away from everything we just covered, it is this: the line between limited pressure and full-scale war is thinner than most people realize, and once that line gets crossed, there is rarely an easy way back. Every strike, every statement, every troop movement is another step down a path that becomes harder to reverse the further it goes. Whether the coming weeks bring a return to negotiations, a narrower operation aimed at specific targets, or something far larger and more dangerous, one thing is certain: the decisions being made right now, in rooms most of us will never see, are going to shape the region for years to come. Thank you for watching this all the way through. Stories like this deserve careful attention, not just quick reactions, and I am grateful you spent this time here getting the full picture instead of settling for a headline. If you want to stay ahead of this story as it develops, subscribe, keep the notifications on, and I will keep bringing you the clearest, most accurate breakdown I can find every single time something changes. I will see you in the next one.